Hey there, Writing Workshop. Time for part 2 of today's lesson, Act of a Hero. Had to take my sweatshirt off because I was just wrestling with some toddlers, and I am sweaty. So, just kind of that weird situation where it's cold outside and warm for the moment inside. Again, I hope you guys are having some fun, finding some relaxation today while we're out of school, or while we're out of the school building, I should say. Let's use today to catch up on missing work, and also to move ahead a little bit in our course 2. Go back out right here. Once again, Act of a Hero is the only analysis I have for you today. In our next lesson, I'll give you actually a bunch of options you can watch of me analyzing poems, songs, and artwork as well. Before we look at Act of a Hero, I want to look at this document that I posted for you guys to look at here, Literary Devices Overview. Now this document is a beast, I'll warn you about it. It's 8 pages long, but I wanted to give you kind of a list of possible literary terms and devices that you can use for the sake of analysis. These range from being really, really useful to really, really obscure as well. So for instance, if I look at number 1, allegory, a story in which people, things, and actions represent ideas about life. Allegories often give moral lessons. Odds are you're probably not going to choose an allegory as your short story, if you choose a short story at all. But I want you to at least be able to use that as a line of analysis if it helps you. This does go in alphabetical order, so allegory is the first one on the list, and it just ranges all the way through, what's the last one I end with, voice as well. Like I said, a lot of these are obscure, so there's a lot of these that you probably won't choose as a route for analysis, but there are some big ones that are key as well. I'll kind of blow through this list rather quickly here, but I just want to give you some ideas on things to look for, whether you're doing a story, a poem, a song, or a song. There aren't any art terms on here. I think what I'll do in our next lesson, I'll post a website that kind of gives an overview on how to look for artistry in visual art as well. Alliteration, be on the lookout for poetry devices, things like repeated consonant sounds and vowel sounds. Allusions are big, especially in poetry and songs. I would take a look for there. Allusions are any references to other works of literature, pop culture, people, places, things. There's a lot of those, especially in poetry and music. Some of these are types of poetry, things like ballad. If you can tell that your poem's telling a story, or your song is telling a story, you might say that, you might frame it as being a ballad. All the terms of character and characterization are here, so if you're doing a short story or a narrative poem, and it seems that characters are important, I would take a look at that. Let's keep going. Conflict is there too, if you're doing a story. Notice connotation and denotation. So if you're looking at meanings, let's say you're reading a short story, and the author does some interesting playing with words, where words are used in a way that goes away from its dictionary definition. You might discuss connotation there. Contrasts are huge, especially if you're doing music, poetry, or artwork. Some of these are poetic rhyming terms like couplets. Dialogue might be important if you're doing a short story that relies heavily on character speech. Figurative language, so I showed this in one of my example thesis statements in the last video. If your piece of literature seems to rely heavily on similes, metaphors, hyperboles, irony, oxymorons, all those examples, those are also listed in here with their definitions. Foreshadowing might be important, especially if you're doing a short story. Imagery is another fancy word for sensory details, so if your story or poem or song relies heavily on sensory details, this actually works for physical visual art as well, is to discuss imagery, sensory details. There's an overview of irony here. There's a big overview of meter here. If you're doing a poem especially, maybe poem or song that really plays around with rhythm, you might be able to analyze that. Analyzing meter can get really complex, so I'd be careful with that if I were you, but if it's important in the text that you've chosen, by all means take a look at it. Mood and tone are in here as well. So mood or atmosphere is the feeling that the literary work conveys. Motifs. A couple of things with narrative. So narrative poetry, the narrator. I put all the terms of plot in here for you too. I would point out personification. One of the example songs that I'll use uses quite a bit of personification, so we'll take a look at that especially. All the terms of plot, all the parts of plot are here, just to give you some ideas, especially if you're doing a story and you want to analyze how its plot works. Same thing with point of view, so narration ideas are here too. First, odds are you're not going to choose something that's in the second person point of view, but third limited, third omniscient are there. Some terms associated with rhyme, just like it is with meter. If you're doing a poem or song and rhyming is important, by all means, use some of these terms associated with rhyme to identify what's going on. There's sensory details as well. It's another word for imagery. Setting is here. A reminder if the setting of your text is important, take a look at that. Stanzas are how poems and songs are divided. Symbolism is probably going to be important in a number of the texts that you choose, so by all means look for symbols, look for places where artists have used something specific, something concrete to stand for a bigger idea. Usually a symbol is a person, place, object, action. It can also be a number or a color that stands for a bigger idea. For instance, a dove, something you can hold in your hand, may represent peace, which is an idea. Dove can be seen, peace cannot. There is an overview of theme right here. Obviously, you have to discuss theme in your essay. Tone and voice are similar too. Really, mood, tone, voice, and diction kind of relate to one another, so by all means, take a look at those too. By all means, use this document as a guide for you to give you some ideas for analysis. I'll point out as much of this as I can as we look at Act of a Hero today. Go back. You have access to this document at all times, just so you know. Let's look at Act of a Hero. And it says, please watch this video, you're doing it now, for a demonstration of story analysis, and I've got a link right here. One thing you should know about this document that I found for Act of a Hero is you can skip the first, 5 pages or so. We're going to start off right here. I will read this story out loud. I'll probably be pausing at several points to make some points for analysis. But there are 2 things I'm looking for specifically as I think about potentially writing an essay about this text. And let me zoom in here a little bit. As I think about writing an essay about Act of a Hero, there's really 2 questions I've got on my mind as I read the story. The first one is, what is the theme or meaning or message of this work? I have to identify that first because literary analysis is about discussing how artists develop their themes. So I have to know what the meaning is first. The other thing I'm looking for is how the artist develops that theme. So as I'm reading, I'm going to keep an eye out for any literary devices that seem important, and I'll see if I can piece these together into making a thesis statement. This is Act of a Hero by Hugh Garner. George Ellsworth drove slowly along the small town's main street, waving occasionally to the people he knew on the sidewalks. The winter morning was cold and brisk, and the tires of his stake-body truck crunched on the snow. Now and then he hunched his long frame above the wheel as he shifted his position on the seat. Above his smooth, 30-year-old face, his ski cap was pushed back to release a few locks of taffy-colored hair, which hung on his forehead like a boy's. While his truck was being loaded with flour at the mill, he had stepped across the street for a coffee, and now he felt warm and at peace with the world. If nothing delayed him, he could drop off his load at the freight sheds and be back home in time for an early lunch. He left the business blocks of Main Street behind him and rolled down the hill to the residential section of town. As he approached the public school, he glanced in its direction. Several small children spilled from the front door of the school into the street. He slowed his truck, hoping to catch a glimpse of his own youngsters, Barry and Sandra, when they emerged too, for what he thought must be morning recess. When he drew abreast of the school, a larger group of youngsters shot from the doorway and tumbled down the front steps into the snow. They picked themselves up and ran around in frenzied circles, shouting and pointing to the doorway, from which a steady stream of pupils and teachers were hurrying. Now he noticed for the first time that none of them were wearing their outer clothing, despite the cold. The reason became apparent immediately, as a heavy, red-tipped cloud of smoke burst from a window at the side of the building. He twisted the wheel and pulled the truck into the curb. I'm going to stop here for a moment for a little bit of plot analysis. What we've just read is the exposition of this story. So exposition usually introduces us to important characters, setting, events, those kinds of things. So we're introduced to our protagonist, George Ellsworth. One thing to note is that we are given quite a bit about him. So one thing that might be important for analysis are things like sensory details. There's a lot of description going on in this exposition that goes throughout the story. We're also given a little bit of setting. Now, we don't know anything specific about this town. We don't know what town he's in. We know it's a small town. We know that he goes into some kind of cafe. He's stepped across the street for a coffee. We see that he's on Main Street. There's a residential section of town. He approaches the public school. So we're kind of given a picture of what kind of town he lives in right here. So let's kind of take note of setting in this story as well. Exposition always ends with the inciting moment. So the event that kicks off the conflict. We can tell, based on the description, that this school is on fire. He notices a heavy red-tipped cloud of smoke burst from a window at the side of the building. He twisted the wheel and pulled the truck into the curb. One thing I'm noticing so far, too, is, what's the author's name? I forget already. Hugh Garner's use of verbs in this story, too. So we might want to look for diction, too, especially verbs. That his truck crunched on the snow. He hunched his long frame. I saw some more, too. Several small children spilled from the front door. He slowed his truck when they emerged. The youngsters shot from the doorway. So notice these very dramatic verbs that the author uses in this story. We're going to take note of those as we go with this, because I might want to use that for analysis. I also noticed a little bit of figurative language, too. The taffy-colored hair hung on his forehead like a boy's. I'm wondering if that detail, describing George Ellsworth as looking sort of boyish, is going to be important in this story. We'll see. As he ran across the sidewalk, he met Mr. Manning, the principal. "Children trapped!" Manning pointed without halting his headlong rush. "Got to phone, firemen, across the street." George felt his body slump, another verb, as if it was suddenly drained of blood. He shoved his way through the screaming crowd of children, trying to spot the faces of his own son and daughter. As he stumbled about, unable to see them, his fear grew to panic, and he began shouting their names above the hubbub about him. Now and then, youngsters, singly or in hand-holding pairs, groped their way through the doorway, wiping their eyes and screaming with fright before rushing down the front steps into the crowd. These children were much younger than the ones he had seen running from the building, and George remembered with horror that the kindergarten classroom was situated at the rear of the old building. It was the room in which his youngest child, Barry, was a pupil. Clawing, another great verb, his way through the mob of children, he reached the front steps. The front door opened, and out of a choking cloud of heavy smoke came the kindergarten teacher, carrying a little girl in her arms. Clinging to her skirts and to each other were 4 other youngsters, their faces gray and their eyes wide-staring despite the acrid smoke. None of them were his own 2 children. He grabbed the young kindergarten teacher by the arm. "Are there any more inside?" he screamed at her. She nodded, coughing. "I lost some, I'm afraid." He pulled open the heavy door and ran headlong into the smoke-filled hallway. Ahead of him, showing beneath the billowing clouds of smoke, were 2 small girls, running across the hallway or corridor from one classroom to another. Farther along, towards the rear of the building, one wall was blazing. There was a sound like the whimpering of wounded dogs. Another simile right there. He peered into 2 empty classrooms nearest him, then bent low as he ran along the corridor to another classroom, into which he had seen the 2 little girls disappear a moment before. This room was almost free of smoke, and the 2 children were climbing to the top of the radiator so they could reach the catch on a window. They were in no immediate danger from either the flames or smoke, and George knew they would be rescued as soon as they were seen from outside. He turned from the classroom door and saw the flames had now scaled the wall and were licking their way across the ceiling. Another great verb. On their trailing edge, large sheets of wallboard were hanging like fiery stalactites, curling and undulating in the intense heat. When he drew closer to the fire, the heat engulfed him in a nauseating wave, and turning his head away, he groped for the parka on his sheepskin jacket and pulled it over his head. In order to reach the rear of the corridor, where he felt certain his own children were trapped, he would have to run the gauntlet of the flames. Notice that we are given some footnotes on meanings right here. So stalactites is here, gauntlet is here. I could use those, I could not, just kind of depends. It flashed through his mind that he had often thought of rescuing a family from a burning house, especially if it was his own. It had seemed such a simple, fundamental act of manhood when he had thought of it. Now, facing the painful, stabbing flames that barred his path, and choking on the heavy smoke, he hesitated. From behind the fire came the sobbing cries of the trapped children, their screams muted now by the crackling roar of the nearby flames. He edged slowly into the burning section of the corridor, but a quick stabbing flame reaching towards his face made him retreat. "I'm a coward," he realized suddenly through the panic that now closed in on him. "Now, the one time in my life when I needed courage, I have none." With a coward's clarity, he rationalized. "Perhaps my kids have already reached the yard," excusing his fear and hesitation. There was only the slightest chance of getting through to the children on the other side of the fire, and if he failed, it would mean the loss of his own life as well as theirs. And it was quite probable that they would be rescued by the firemen through the rear windows of the school. That morning at breakfast, young Barry had asked, Can I go out into the truck with you this afternoon, Daddy? God. He took his step towards the fire once again, fighting the cowardly voice of reason that told him to turn and run. I'm noticing here a little point of analysis. One of the things I remembered seeing in that document I just showed you are flashbacks. We have a little flashback right here where he remembers something his son had said. And there's another one where he says that he's thought about what it would be like to save his family from his burning house before as well. That might be important for analysis too. Can I go out with you this afternoon, Daddy? Of course, of course. Now he remembered. The children had stayed home from school today so that their mother could take them to the dentist. They weren't in the blazing school at all, but back in the center of town at the dentist office. Oh, dear God. Suddenly the conflicting fears and hesitations dropped their weight from his heart. This paragraph right here, as we talk about plot some more, is probably the climax of this story. The climax would be the turning point. It's where there's a dramatic change. Here, there's this dramatic change too, where George realizes he doesn't even have to be in this building because his children were at the dentist office all along. Notice the big shift in his conflict is right here. The conflicting fears and hesitations completely drop from his heart. That would note that everything before this point is rising action, everything to follow is falling action as well. When he once again noticed the fire, his estimation of his chances of getting through it had become impersonal, and now the space between the burning piles of wallboard and wood paneling had narrowed considerably. It would be almost impossible to crawl or run between them without being burned. The sobbing of the trapped children and the noise of the fire were suddenly dimmed in his ears by the rising wail of sirens from the street, showing him that the fire trucks had arrived. He was no longer forced to make a decision, and he backed away from the flames and smoke with hurried, stumbling eagerness. As he hurried back along the corridor, he glanced into the room where he had last seen the two little girls. They were standing on a ledge, silhouetted against the window, and had almost succeeded in opening a space large enough to crawl through. He had to accomplish something to justify his frightened return to the outside. He ran between the desks and picked both of the children from the window ledge, and with one beneath each arm hurried out of the room and along the corridor to the front door. As he emerged from inside the building, there was a loud cheer from the children on the lawn and from the thickening crowd of adults who were approaching to the school along the street. Several cars parked along the curbs gave him an accolade with their horns. He set the two little girls on their feet in the snow and allowed the teachers and some newly arrived parents to pump his arm and shout their thanks in his ear. When he remembered the children still trapped at the rear of the building, he shouted the information to a passing fireman. Much later, after being interviewed briefly by a young man from the Clarion, a local paper, he was able to drag himself away from the admiring crowd that now surrounded him. The fire was out, and the trapped children in the kindergarten class had all been rescued by the firemen. The school children had formed into classes, and the only casualty was a small boy who had been overcome by smoke. As George climbed into his truck, he heard the principal shout, "Now, children, let's give 3 cheers and a tiger for Mr. Ellsworth." With the children's cheers echoing like a mockery, another simile, behind him, he stepped on the gas and pushed the truck as far as he could away from the school. He took his time unloading the flour at his destination and drove as slowly as he could on the way home. When he arrived at his house in the late afternoon, the kitchen table was set, and his smiling wife and children came to the back door to meet him. After making himself ready for supper, he sat down at a table and glanced up into the beaming face of his wife. She pointed in front of him at the open newspaper propped against the sugar bowl. There was a photograph of himself coming down the school steps with the 2 little girls under his arms, and a headline over the story of that fire that read, "The Act of a Hero." He swept the paper from the table to the floor. "Are you mad, Daddy?" Sandra asked, in open-mouthed wonder. He stared down at his plate, unable to face his wife and children. "Why are you mad, Daddy?" his daughter asked again. It was an unanswerable question. It was a question he would be unable to answer for the rest of his life. So kind of a depressing ending for this story, right? One thing we might notice, the title is Act of a Hero, but we end up with a question, not an answer. Is what George Ellsworth did heroic or not? Considering the fact that he did not rush into the burning room to try to save any of the children trapped inside, considering that he gave up on that when he realized that his own children were out of the building. The town thinks that he is a hero because of the 2 girls who were not in immediate danger that he pulled out of the building. Clearly, George does not feel like a hero, but we're kind of left with the question, is he a hero? Is the title being serious, or is it ironic? Is George Ellsworth a hero or not? And we're left to discuss that. Now, this is open for interpretation. So what is the theme or meaning or message of this work? We can go either way on this. One thing I'm noticing, and one idea that I might have here, is that I might say something like, heroism does not always have perfect results. I have an idea on how I might develop that as well as we talk about devices right there. If I were to go the opposite direction on heroism in this story, I might suggest that heroes, in quotation marks, are not necessarily as great as they seem. So notice, once again, the end of this story leaves us with a question, not an answer. Is George Ellsworth a hero or not? One of my ideas right here, if I want to say that he is a hero, I'm going to suggest thematically that heroism does not always have perfect results. I could argue that it was heroic for George to go into the building in the first place, but it didn't have perfect results, right? He wasn't able to rescue everyone in that building. He found out that he was truly a coward, or that he was a coward in the end of it, right? There was still a child who died in that building that he could not save. Does that make him less of a hero? Maybe, maybe not. If I suggest that he's still a hero, I'm going to note the ugliness of this story as well. Another thing, if I'm going to argue that George is not a hero, I'm going to go with the theme that heroes as we know them, notice all the praise and attention that he got, are not necessarily as great as they seem. And that perception really impacts that. How does the artist develop this theme? I'm just going to list off everything that we noted as we read the story, and I'll kind of see if I can piece these together into a theme. First thing we notice, parts of plot. I might notice especially like the peaceful exposition, really dramatic rising action, climax, maybe removes the burden, George, and then not so dramatic falling. Gotcha. So right there, I could choose to go plot analysis on this. I think that lends itself a little bit better to theme number 2 that I came up with there. Another thing I noticed was diction. I'll say diction slash figurative, or not figurative, diction slash sensory details. I might say verbs are especially dark and dramatic. What else do we note? Flashbacks. Several key memories that impact George's thinking. Was there anything else I noted in that story? I did note similes too. And we talked about that first simile. I want to go back there real quick. That first simile, that first comparison, it hung on his forehead like a boy's. That simile might be suggesting that second theme, that George is not a hero. He's just a boy, just a scared little boy, no matter how manly he is. We notice here that he has a long frame, so he's a large man, maybe not gigantic, but he's 30. He's a working man. He seems to be a tough guy. He's brave enough to go into a burning building. But we see that there's this little detail that kind of paints him in more of a boyish light as well. I'm trying to look for that other one too. The sound like the whimpering of wounded dogs as well. Again, that suggests fear or cowardice. So I'm going to say similes, especially discuss idea of fear. I think that's good. That's a good enough start for me right here. I'll write 2 potential thesis statements. One for theme number 1 that I identified, one for theme number 2. So as I piece these together, I think the best thing for showing theme number 1 is that use of diction and sensory details. So I might say something like, let's get a thesis here. Hugh Garner, tense, diction, and imagery instead of sensory detail in Act of a Hero. I'll use show for now. I don't really like the verb show, so I'll replace that in a moment. To show that heroism does not always yield perfect results. Yeah, that works. So if I want a good one-sentence thesis, intense diction and imagery, this might once again lend itself to 2 body paragraphs, one for diction, so one where I'll probably talk about the verbs of this story, especially how they paint George as a hero, but also how they show just kind of how ugly acts of heroism can be. Imagery is where I'm going to focus on everything else. So I'll look at adjectives, I'll look at descriptive nouns, and piece those together into the drama of this story as well. Thesis 2. I want to see if I can write a thesis that yields or that lends itself to 3 body paragraphs here. So here I want to talk about how heroes are not always as great as they seem. Let's see, 2-sentence thesis. I might put the theme first here. The theme of Hugh Garner's Act of the Hero is that heroes are not, did I say always? I said necessarily. I'll say always. As great as they seem. And now I'm going to discuss the devices that piece that together right here. The story's plot. I'll just do this as a 5-paragraph essay. 1, 2, 3. The story's plot. Flashbacks. And we'll say similes. I'll develop this theme. And I use the word theme twice. We'll say something like the message of Hugh Garner's Act of a Hero is that heroes are not always as great as they seem. The story's plot, flashbacks, and similes all develop this theme. That's probably the order in which I would do those body paragraphs too. Plot's always a good idea to do first because it kind of allows you to summarize for your audience as well as analyze. Flashbacks kind of bring the analysis even further. Those specific flashbacks kind of revolve around George's cowardice. And then the similes, once again, that raise the idea of fear, once again, is a good way to close out my body paragraphs here. That's just an example of how to do some really basic analysis on a story, specifically. If I were to do this as a full essay, I would use one of these as my thesis statements. Then I would pull specific quotes and paraphrases from the story to raise that up. So I say intense diction. I need to find examples of those verbs throughout the story and explain how they develop that theme of heroism. Same thing with imagery, same thing with plot, flashbacks, similes. You get the idea. Once again, for now, go back to our lesson here. Once again, for now, really not much that you need to do for this particular essay besides start thinking about what kind of text that you'd like to do. In our next lesson, I'll give you similar, shorter examples of how to analyze poems, songs, and artwork. Best of luck. Continue to complete missing work for me. I'll send out those grade reports on Wednesday evening.